So he actually he can't fathom, he can't understand that this moment is outside of that accident that happened. It's like it's like it won't end now. We don't know when it's going to end. Like he says, trauma is the ultimate experience of this will last forever. And here he has an important bit, right? Stan's scan reveals why people can recover from trauma only when the brain structures that were knocked out during the original experience, which is why the event registered in the brain as trauma in the first place, are fully online. Visiting the past in therapy should be done while people are biologically speaking, firmly grounded in the present and feeling as calm, safe, and grounded as possible. Grounded means that you can feel your butt in the chair, see the light coming through the windows, feel the tension in your calves, and hear the wind stirring the tree outside. Being anchored in the present while revisiting the trauma opens the possibility of deeply knowing that the terrible events belong to the past. For that to happen, the brain's watchtower, cook, and timekeeper need to be online. Therapy won't work as long as people keep being pulled back into the past. Hello, everyone. Welcome to GariTalks book review. I am Gary. GariTalks is a space that I have created for us to have conversations around healing, focusing on the inner child, talking about shadow work, talking about our inner landscape, trying to understand what's going on inside our internal world, because there's so much important information in here that we don't really always know how to interpret. And as we'll find out with this book, trauma is an experience that is overwhelming overwhelms your literal ability to cope with it. And it is also, so it's the event, but it's also the imprint that is left on you by that event. So the internal wound that occurs after something like that changes your whole nervous system, right? And so trauma makes things different, right? It makes it more difficult to talk about the things that you're experiencing. We're not even just talking about the shame that comes with being traumatized. Like if you've experienced something that, a classic example I think is like sexual violence, right? If you were raped or molested and such like this, it's very hard to talk about that and be upfront about it because our society does not hold space for that. So there's a lot of shame, but in addition to the shame, right, there's a whole other thing that's going on in our bodies on top of that. The way that you're now perceiving threats, the internal science, your hormones, what you think is safe in the world, what you think is dangerous in the world, these things are altered after an event like that. Right? Especially if we're talking about things with our caretakers, right? If our caretakers were the source of terror and abuse in our lives, now we got all this strange interconnection between care and abuse, and it changes again the way that we process the world and interact with it. And so this book is like revolutionary to me. It has been going in about the science of the brain, so in chapter 4 earlier, we talked about, so here's a little recap, right? We talked about our brain is built for survival. At the end of the day, no matter what it is that we're invested in, doesn't matter where we get into, doesn't matter if the situation is harmful, helpful, the brain is going to help us survive. Its main job is to ensure our welfare, our well-being, and for us to survive, to live another day, to make a different set of choices. It don't really care. Its main job is to keep us functioning. Because if it's off, if the brain dies, then it has nothing to do anymore, right? So it's like literally built. It's the one thing in us that really drives us forward. It's evolutionary. The brain is built from the bottom up, right? Starting with the reptilian brain or the brain stem. That is the part of our brain that is closest, I would say, closest to the body, right? It's like here. It's where your spinal cord connects with your skull. Right, it goes into the skull, and that is responsible for your physiology, right? This is what babies already can do when they're born: cry, eat, pee and poop, right? Release toxins from their body, feel uncomfortable, feel pain. Those basic things that make you in a body come from the reptilian brain. Then we move up to the limbic system, also known as the mammalian brain, and that's more so about it's like surviving in a group because human beings are social beings, right? We grow in social settings. So the mammalian brain is responsible for getting your needs met. So you feel the need from the reptilian brain, you cry out, right? And you start to realize that you have an interaction with the world around you, right? So it's still focused on you and getting your needs met, but it is now more about the connections that you're building with other people. It's what's responsible for the communication between mom and baby, right? It develops after we're born. And then on the top layer of the brain is the neocortex, which develops latest in life, so after we're 2 years old. It only takes up 30% of the brain, and that part is the higher thinking, right? Sequencing things, planning for the future, empathy, being able to relate to now that you've related to yourself and understand yourself through the bottom two parts of the brain, right? Now you can higher think and connect with other people. And the neocortex is also what's responsible for us to, making history, making meaning of things. So we share a lot of our parts with animals. However, our neocortex is a lot thicker and denser because this is what differentiates us from animals, because we are animals. However, this higher order thinking is very different than other animals, right? We reviewed last time, we talked about the right and the left brain, which is super cool, right? If you've ever heard people say, oh, like I'm more left-brained, they're usually talking about being more analytical, being more logical, maybe they like math, right? And then right brain is creative, visual, all that stuff, but it's not true, right? You can't just be one-brained, left or right. You have to use both sides of your brain in order to work properly. You might lean on one more. You might like the specialties of one, right? So the left side is focused on linguistics. It is logical. It is analytical. It is sequential. It organizes our experiences into logical sequences. It translates our feelings into words, helps us to identify cause and effect. We can grasp the long-term effects of things. Because again, if we're thinking about this is where time is being kept too, it's the thing that makes meaning of things. So things aren't just random shits happening. Oh, this happened before, this might happen again in the future, right? And then it helps us to create plans for the future too. I've heard losing your mind is experiencing a loss of this side of your brain, the executive functioning, right? This is telling you a lot of things what to do. As he said in the book, this side, the left, I keep gesturing to the right because it's mirrored. The left side of the brain does the talking, right? Because it's linguists, it's sequencing, all that stuff. But the right side provides the music of expression. So we're talking body language. We're talking facial expressions, right? We're talking making sounds like singing, swearing, crying, dancing. That's from the right side of the brain. So yes, the left side does the talking, but the right side also talks. It talks in a different way, right? It talks through the emotions that are evoked in you. It automatically reacts to faces, facial features, voices, gestures, and places experienced in the past. So it's actually the part that it's been conditioned to remember sounds, touches, smells, emotions, and they evoke emotions from that. So it's what feels like the truth. When you remember something and it feels felt, that is you remembering from your right side of your brain, right? So these two brains need to work together to make a full spectrum experience. Like just thinking about your memories, right? Something that he talked about is when trauma happens, the right side of the brain becomes super active and the left side of the brain shuts down a lot of the time. So if the right side of the brain, which is the creative, visual, emotional part of the brain, this is going haywire, right? It's going off, feeling, and this is at the heart of today's conversation. We're talking about dissociation. So it's caught up in all the memories of the trauma. And then the left side, which is about ordering and about sequencing and about putting things in logical order, shuts down. So you're caught in your memories, right? You're trapped in a flashback. You're trapped with all these sensations and not knowing how to make sense of it because both sides of your brain are not working in tandem, how they should be working together, right? And that's really important. And that will come up today. We'll talk a little bit about that. But again, we're still in the little mini recap part. We talked about the amygdala last time. That's the smoke detector of the brain. It is located in the limbic system. It's two structures actually. And its main purpose is to detect threat and then tell the body we are in threat, we are in danger mode, and then kick off the fight or flight response. So when you feel like you perceive a danger, right? It can be an opportunity too, but if you perceive a change in your environment, then now you need to prepare for it. Your body's going to start preparing. Your heart rate's going to start going up. Your blood pressure's going to rise. Your breathing might become more shallow. Or, because you're trying to get ready, you're fueling the muscles to do something. We're either going to run from here or we're going to fight, right? So the amygdala smoke detector. Very important, right? So it's important to have a smoke detector, right? But when it gets faulty, that's what we're going to be talking about today. The MPFC is the medial prefrontal cortex that is located near the front of the brain in the center. It's the watchtower. So the amygdala and the MPFC work together to create our emotional intensity, right? So how? The amygdala is sensing threat, which is usually urgent, right? So it's going to feel intense. You're going to feel visceral, meaning in the body responses. The MPFC, the medial prefrontal cortex, as the watchtower, its job is to differentiate. So you smell smoke. Is that my house burning down? Or is that the smoke from the steak I'm cooking? Right? It's what allows us to differentiate. It is, and with mindfulness, when we practice mindfulness, which is just observing, being able to hover above ourselves almost and look at our thoughts, you are strengthening the muscle of your medial prefrontal cortex that allows you to take a objective, larger, higher view over everything. So you would see why the drive for threat, I'm nervous, but then being able to think about it creates emotional intensity. If you can't think about it, it feels more emotionally intense, right? And just if something feels very visceral, sometimes you can think about it, but you might still feel about it, right? But those two work together to determine how intense emotions rise and feel in you, okay? Then we talked about the thalamus, which is the cook. It's kind of like it takes in all the sensations from outside. So you take in a lot of sensations from your eyes, ears, and skin, right? Like somebody touching you, you will perceive that. You seeing things, right? But it is the thalamus that actually cooks it together into this, he calls autobiographical soup, or really autobiographical memory, being able to be like, this is me. This is happening to me now. This is what has happened to me in the past. Through sensation. So cooking all the sensations together into saying, okay, like when I'm being, compressed and held around and I feel surrounded, it's a hug, right? The thalamus is the part that helps to make sense of that. It's also, which makes sense, the filter and the gatekeeper for relevant information. He uses the example in the book. If you're reading this book right now, but you hear sounds outside and your stomach is grumbling, your thalamus is working, right? So it can distinguish between, okay, we're reading right now, so we can finish the reading, and then we don't need to go, to every sound, and do right? We can be able to focus, and that's how we know our thalamus is working. We also know that when we are impacted by trauma, first thing to go is often concentration and focus. So again, today we're talking about how all these parts of the brain break down. I'm now just saying what we recapped last time, how the brain usually works. And we also talked about the hippocampus briefly with the amygdala. It relates new input to past experiences, right? So every time we don't have time, and all these systems minus the MPFC, they're in the limbic system. And the limbic system, the mammalian brain, which is usually paired with the brainstem or the reptilian brain, and this book he calls it the emotional brain, because those two things work together for our survival and our well-being all the time. They don't have time to think about what it might be, or how this time might be different than last time. That's the job of the neocortex. The other parts, the survival parts, are just like, this seems like a last time. We're executing protocol, y'all. It's time to go. We're doing what we've practiced. And this is crucial to understand, because when trauma comes in, the first place is going to affect, it's going to affect the whole being, right? It's going to affect the entire organism. But it's going to knock out the first part first, right? Neocortex, ain't nobody got time to think higher order about what's going on after trauma, because the whole point is your brain has been knocked out to deal with a lot of things. And we'll look at visuals. It'll be really useful. And then the next part is going to affect, because if your survival is at stake, which is usually what's happening in a traumatic experience, you're fighting for your life, right? Now the emotional brain is being impacted, and that's what we're going to talk about. So First, just one part of the brain I'll introduce to you now, and then we'll talk about it in context since we were just talking about the brain, is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So the medial prefrontal, you don't need to know all these things. I'm just giving them to you in case anybody is nerdy like me and wants all the details. The MPFC, medial prefrontal cortex, is the front, medial of the brain. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex are these two areas on the right and left that are also in the front, but on the sides. He said you can consider them the timekeeper, right? So they tell how our present experience relates to the past and how it will affect the future. Okay. So the timekeeper gets involved, and I'll let you know when we get there. But that's just a part of the brain we'll be introducing today. But everything else you've heard before if you've been watching the series. Today we specifically are talking about, we understand how the brain works. It's built for our survival. There's things that work in order. They fire and secrete hormones for us to do things, right? They order the thoughts. They keep track of things. That's the normal brain. Today we're talking about brain on trauma. We're going to talk about dissociation, which is the essence of trauma, right? Associate, right? Like I think about assemble. Assemble is to put together. Associate is like if this is associated to this, you're relating them, right? Disassemble is to take apart. Disassociate is to make them not relate anymore, right? So when we dissociate, when the experience of trauma, something that's coming in that's so overwhelming, it's like we can't actually hold the space to process it all as one thing that's happening. It splits off and it's fragmented into sounds, images, thoughts, behaviors, physical sensations. So they're split off, and that's how we are able to deal with it. That's dissociation. There's a symptom of dissociation that we'll talk about too called depersonalization, which is the loss of the self, which is essentially, and we'll get to that example where somebody entirely shuts down in the face of trauma, and recovering is very different. But he essentially is talking about, right, the way that our brains are impacted during a traumatic event will usually dramatically affect our brain, right? It's going to shut down parts of our brain. It's going to overactivate other parts of our brain. And the heart of this chapter is that it is key for us to identify. This is why we need to know the brain. Which parts of the brain shut down? Which parts of the brains went haywire, overactive when we were experiencing trauma? And how can we restore balance and restore those brain structures into functioning order? So if the thalamus went out during trauma, right? The thing that cooks it into this is happening to me. So now everything's just, you can't quite remember what was happening to you. Is just in bites and pieces and memories. Now we have to strengthen the thalamus, right? To try to bring it back online so that you can perceive information on a full scale again, not just in little pieces. And when we do that, that is the healing work, right? So as often he does, he starts with a story. And this is the case study of this chapter is Stan and Ute. So in September 1999, Stan and Ute, they were a professional couple in their 40s. They left from their home in London, Ontario to head to a business meeting in Detroit. Halfway through the journey, they ran into a wall of dense fog that reduced visibility to zero in a split second. Stan immediately slammed on the brakes, coming to a standstill sideways on the highway, just missing a huge truck. An 18-wheeler went flying over the trunk of their car. Vans and cars slammed into them and into each other. People who got out of their cars were hit as they ran for their lives. The ear-splitting crashes went on and on. With each jolt from behind, they felt this would be the one that killed them. Stan and Ute were trapped in car number 13 of an 87-car pileup. The worst road disaster in Canadian history. I got chills from that. Then came the eerie silence. Stan struggled to open the doors and windows, but the 18-wheeler that had crushed their trunk was wedged against the car. Suddenly, someone was pounding on their roof. This part is gruesome. A girl was screaming, "Get me out of here, I'm on fire." Helplessly, they watched her die as the car she had been in was consumed by flames. The next thing they knew, a truck driver was standing on the hood of their car with a fire extinguisher. He smashed the windshield to free them, and Stan climbed through the opening. Turning around to help his wife, he saw Ute frozen in her seat. Stan and the truck driver lifted her out, and an ambulance took them to emergency room. Aside from a few cuts, they were found to be physically unscathed. Surprisingly, thank God, right? No physical harm. However, at home that night, neither Stan nor Ute wanted to go to sleep. They felt that if they let go, they would die. They are irritable, jumpy, and on edge. That night, and for many to come, they drank copious quantities of wine to numb their fear. They could not stop the images that were haunting them or the questions that went on and on. What if they left earlier? What if they hadn't stopped for gas? You know, all this trying to figure out. And eventually they go seek help from a psychiatrist. This psychiatrist, Dr. Lanius, Ruth Lanius, she was a student of Dr. Bessel at the trauma center a few years ago, and they did a brain imaging thing. So they used an fMRI to measure the neural activity in the brain by tracking changes in blood flow to the brain. So seeing how the blood flows and where it flows to, and seeing then, right, that's what part of your brain is lighting up. And the way, and Bessel did this in a previous chapter, they created a script that was like, it's not the exact story, right? Not like, not necessarily it is in theme of the story, right? You're leaving your house, you get on the road, but they wrote it as though the way that trauma is remembered in fragments, in bright flashes, right? So probably talking about, like, a lot of what we just talked about was in that script, right? The fire, the woman, the windshield moment. But trying to create an accurate I don't want to say re-experience, because that's what ends up happening. Trying to create an accurate script to capture what that traumatic experience was like. So they put them in the scan, read it, and then just see what the body does. He went in, he came out sweating, heart racing, blood pressure sky high. This was just the way I felt during the accident, he reported. I was sure I was going to die, and there was nothing I could do to save myself. Instead of remembering the accident as something that had happened 3 months earlier, Stan was reliving it. And this is what he's always talking about in this book. He keeps bringing it back, and I don't think, and I think it's on purpose, right? And I think it's something that we don't always hold. When someone is reliving their trauma, and when we have dissociated our trauma, so our trauma is over there because we couldn't deal with it, or we had to dissociate different parts of it to not deal with it, every time we're remembering it, or if we're triggered to remember it, it's not like a memory. It's not like, I remember the time I was trapped in the car and I couldn't get out, but it's the full body response, the whole body, because he's back in the spot where he couldn't leave. He's back trapped in that car, helpless. You know what I'm saying? Dissociation is the essence of trauma. The overwhelming experience is split off and fragmented, like I said, so that the emotions, sounds, images, thoughts, and physical sensations related to the trauma take on a life of their own. The sensory fragments of memory intrude into the present, where they are literally relived. As long as the trauma is not resolved, the stress hormones that the body secretes to protect itself keep circulating, and the defensive movements and emotional responses keep getting replayed. Unlike Stan, however, many people may not be aware of the connection between their crazy feelings and reactions and the traumatic events that are being replayed. They have no idea why they respond to some minor irritation as if they were about to become annihilated. So, for instance, say Stan is wearing like a sweater and the zipper gets stuck, right? It might be something small, but it might trigger him into a feeling of, I feel trapped and I can't get out of this. For some people, because he knew he was in a big car accident that fucked him up, that he could not escape from, he might be able to be like, okay, I know I'm just spazzing because, I can't get out of this sweater, and it just reminds me of that time I couldn't get out of a car and I was dying, right? But if say that accident happened way young, when he was like 2, right, before the age of 7, and so he didn't really know that happened, but that happened, he might be responding like that and not knowing why. I mean, I've never been in any kind of car accident. I don't know what happened. Or maybe he was pinned, if you were pinned down as a kid, right, that, you know what I'm saying? If you're not consciously aware of it, you're reliving these things in fragments through emotions now without knowing why. And that's flashbacks, and reliving are in some ways worse than the trauma itself. A traumatic event has a beginning and an end. At some point, it is over. But for people with PTSD, a flashback can occur at any time, whether they're awake or asleep. There's no way of knowing when it's going to occur again or how long it will last. People who suffer from flashbacks often organize their lives around trying to protect against them. They may compulsively go to the gym to pump iron, but find that they're never strong enough, numb themselves with drugs, or try to cultivate an illusory sense of control in high danger situations like motorcycle racing, bungee jumping, or working as an ambulance driver. Constantly fighting unseen dangers is exhausting and leaves them fatigued, depressed, and weary. If the elements of the trauma are replayed over and over again, the accompanying stress hormones engrave those memories ever more deeply into the mind. So the more you activate these pathways of your trauma, right? So this helplessness, this out of control feeling, this overwhelming, this is too much, I have to numb, right? Every time you replay that and relive it, you're digging those memories deeper and deeper, because the hormones, when you think about the memory, the hormones are going off in your body. Your body is reacting like a threat is happening. So you're training your body to hold on to these memories deep, because we need this information, baby. You never quite know when it's going to happen again. And that's useful for what we think is our control. But as he says, ordinary day-to-day events become less and less compelling. Not being able to take in what is going on around them makes it impossible to feel fully alive. It becomes harder to feel the joys and aggravations of ordinary life, harder to concentrate on the task at hand. Not being fully alive in the present keeps them more firmly imprisoned in the past. Right? So you want to be present, but you can't let go. And so you're in this tension and you're trapped in the past. Because we're trapped in the past, our bodies are trapped in the past, our memories, our minds are trapped in the past, our responses, our literal hormonal, the science inside our body is responding to past things. It creates triggers, right? So if you suddenly experience something that reminds you of that consciously, unconsciously, you're going to be triggered. So veterans may react to the slightest cue, like hitting a bump in the road or seeing a kid playing in the street, as if they were in a war zone. Startle easily, become enraged or numb. Victims of childhood sexual abuse may anesthetize, neutralize their sexuality, and then feel intensely ashamed if they become excited by sensations or images that recall their molestation, even when those sensations are natural pleasures associated with particular body parts. If trauma survivors are forced to discuss their experiences, one person's blood pressure may increase while another responds with the beginnings of a migraine headache. Still others may shut down emotionally and not feel any obvious changes. However, in the lab, we have no problem detecting their racing hearts, and stress hormones churning through their body. So outside, it might look like nothing's happening, right? People who shut down are shutting down, but you can still feel the stress hormones in their body. You can see them on the brain scans, These reactions are irrational, largely outside of people's control. Intense and barely controllable urges and emotions make people feel crazy and makes them feel like they don't belong to the human race. Feeling numb during birthday parties for your kid or in response to the death of loved ones makes people feel like monsters. As a result, shame becomes a dominant emotion, and hiding the truth, the central preoccupation. So because we can't be normal, so we feel ashamed, right? It's the most important feeling. The biggest feeling that we feel is just shame. Shame is like something is wrong with me. So you just feel like something is wrong with me and you just hide the truth, right? That's like, so we come up with a cover story, right? Or we numb ourselves. We engage in other behaviors, but we don't deal with actually what's going on. They are rarely in touch with the fact that these sensations have their origins in traumatic experiences. And that is where therapy comes in, right? It's important to get people. And I love what he says here, right? The reason that it's important for people to recognize their trauma is to recognize, like, it's back then. That happened then. We're still experiencing it now, but it happened then, right? But it's not enough to just talk about it, because that's not real for people, right? What this whole chapter talks about is that your body changed, your brain changed to adapt to the danger. So now you telling me that I'm safe doesn't mean that I know that I'm safe. I have to be able to feel that I'm safe so that I can access those memories and distinguish between past and present. The trauma that started out as out there, right? That's something that happened outside, is now played out in the battlefield of our own bodies, usually without a conscious connection between what happened back then and what's going on now. So if we haven't held space for our trauma, like as a kid, if you were abused, And now you're scared all the time, but you don't know why. But you don't want to. You don't want to. You can't deal with the fact that you were abused, and you've never really explored the connections between those two things. Then it just feels like something's wrong with you. I'm just scared all the time, but you don't think it has anything to do with the fact that you was beat senselessly as a child all the time. You know? And this is what I love. The challenge is not so much learning to accept the terrible things that have happened, but learning how to gain mastery over one's internal sensations and emotions. Sensing, naming, and identifying what is going on is the first step to recovery. So it's actually not even about being able to find that traumatic experience and name it for what it is and talk about it with no emotion and talk about it, or just, be able to talk about it proudly. Or be like, I get that this happened to me and I'm grateful for who it made me become. That is really not even what we're talking about here. It's just actually about being able to name the feelings that you feel. Because trauma, because it dissociates it, right? It makes it into fragments and splits it off from you. These are just vague memories floating around that you relive every now and then. You know what I'm saying? So being able to say, hey, I feel these things inside my body. I'm feeling this. I'm feeling numb. I feel no feelings in my toes. I feel tense. I feel like there's a gripping in my chest. I feel like I can't swallow. These are important things to be able to begin to name yourself, because you have to know what it's really just about understanding what's going on in here. Once you start to understand what's going on in here, I feel like your brain will take more time. Oh, you care about what's going on in here? Okay, maybe we could talk about this thing this one time that's why I do this way, And that's why talk therapy is important. However, you need a body approach too, as he calls that a bottom-up approach, which is bringing the body first, breathing, movement. So coming into the body first, and then bringing it from you go from the brainstem, limbic system, neocortex. That's like bottom up. So you're building awareness through the body. Top down is you're building mindfulness first to be aware that you have thoughts and such, and then bring it into the body. Right? Movement in yoga is a big one for that, for the top-down approach. So, did a lot of groundwork laying, and here stands Brain. So they put him in the fMRI machine, right? And this was his brain on trauma. So they read him the script. He's in a machine, not doing shit, just laying there listening. This is what his brain looks like. Why? If y'all remember, he tried to fight back, right? He tried to fight his way. He was struggling to get out. He was freaking out. And so his brain lit up on the right side, a lot on the right. Oh, look at the picture again. This is a lot on the right side. The left side shut down. Here, these are the white spots are all shut down areas, right? But the other parts are super overactive. As you can see, what is this one? His amygdala is dark. It's going in. We in danger, baby. We are in danger. And this is on the right side, though, right? There's two, because our brain is like, if you look at it on one side, you're only going to get one half of it. But we have two little amygdala structures, or two of them make up the amygdala, and they're on both sides of the brain, but they're down here. And I just think it's fascinating that one on the right side, the danger on the right side, danger plus creativity plus vision plus memory is going in, but the left side is shut down, so it can't quite register time. So with this, like I was just saying, the amygdala went crazy, right? It's to him, it made no distinguishment between past or present. It's not like, oh, we were in a car accident 3 months ago. We hearing it now, we in it right now. I'm shook and I'm scared, and we're firing all these stress hormones and nervous system responses to get us out of here. Even though he agreed to this, he knew what it was, but felt the same exact way, which all makes sense with if you were about to get hit, if you just got hit by a car, it makes sense that you feel this way, right? But it doesn't make sense because we're 3 months later and we're safe. We're in another environment. We're just talking about it, and you feel the same exact way. So the brain has gone haywire. The amygdala has gone into hyperdrive mode. Everything is dangerous. Like just hearing about it is dangerous, right? It's important to have an efficient smoke detector. You don't want to get caught unawares by a raging fire, but if you go into a frenzy every time you smell smoke, it becomes intensely disruptive. Yes, you need to detect whether somebody's getting upset with you, but if your amygdala goes into overdrive, you may become chronically scared that people hate you, or you may even feel like they're out to get you, right? Because, again, if it perceives danger, that's also if you think people are dangerous. So it's good to be aware, but then you might think everybody's out to get you if it's overactive. right? The timekeeper collapse. So that's the thing I said we are introducing today, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which are the two parts of the brain in the front but on the sides, which tells us how our present experience relates to the past and how it may affect the future. Knowing that whatever is happening is finite and will sooner or later come to an end makes most experiences tolerable. It is your hippocampus, the part that relates new information with past experiences, and this part of the brain that says how that also relates to how this present experience relates to the past and how it's going to affect the future. So keeping track of time, these two things together, hippocampus and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, create the context and meaning that we understand. So remember, emotional intensity, how deeply intense something is, comes from the amygdala and the MPFC, right? One being like the smoke detector, which is the visceral, something is dangerous, but then being able to be like, okay, but is it that dangerous? Creates emotional intensity. But context comes from these two structures together, hippocampus, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex together, right? Being able to relate new information to the past, plus to be able to understand that this present moment will come to an end because it's not what was past, right? And it's also not the future because there's something in between now and then. Those parts of the brain go off. Or those are the parts of his brain right here, as you see, are white. So he actually can't fathom, he can't understand that this moment is outside of that accident that happened. It's like it's like it won't end now. We don't know when it's going to end. Like he says, trauma is the ultimate experience of this will last forever. And here he has an important bit, right? Stan's scan reveals why people can recover from trauma only when the brain structures that were knocked out during the original experience, which is why the event registered in the brain as trauma in the first place, are fully online. Visiting the past in therapy should be done while people are biologically speaking, firmly grounded in the present and feeling as calm, safe, and grounded as possible. Grounded means that you can feel your butt in the chair, see the light coming through the windows, feel the tension in your calves, and hear the wind stirring the tree outside. Being anchored in the present while revisiting the trauma opens the possibility of deeply knowing that the terrible events belong to the past. For that to happen, the brain's watchtower, cook, and timekeeper need to be online. Therapy won't work as long as people keep being pulled back into the past. All right, my phone died, but I want to finish up. The last thing I'm going to talk about is Ute. So in that car accident, there were two people involved. If you remember, Stan tried to fight back wildly to get out. Ute, remember, she was just frozen in it, right? And the truck driver and Stan had to remove her from the space. She responded to her trauma script by going numb. Her mind went blank, and nearly every part of her brain showed markedly decreased activity. Her heart rate and blood pressure did not elevate. When we asked how she felt during the scan, she replied, "I felt just like I felt at the time of the accident. I felt nothing." And this is Ute's brain on trauma. It is mostly deactivated. Her blood pressure didn't rise. Nothing. There's no fight or flight. She just... That's what dissociation looks like, right? But this is a even deeper. Dissociation is like, even because Stan had dissociation as well. Hers is depersonalization, right? The outward manifestation of the biological freeze response, right? There's fight, flight, and freeze. When we freeze, this is what happens when we outwardly freeze. Depersonalization is one symptom of the massive dissociation created by trauma. Stan's flashbacks came from his thwarted efforts to escape the crash, but instead of struggling to escape, Ute had dissociated her fear and felt nothing. Bessel talks about how he used to work with a lot of folks who were depersonalized, and he was like, he used to feel really drained and felt like frustrated with their lifelessness. They'd tell these stories and just be flat and suck all the energy out of the room. But after seeing Ute's scan, I started to take on a very different approach toward blanked out patients. With nearly every part of their brains tuned out, they obviously cannot think, feel deeply, remember, or make sense out of what is going on. Conventional talk therapy in those circumstances is virtually useless. In Ute's case, it's possible to guess why she responded so differently from Stan. She was utilizing a survival strategy her brain had learned in childhood to cope with her mother's harsh treatment. Ute's father died when she was 9 years old, and her mother subsequently was often nasty and demeaning to her. At some point, Ute discovered she could blank out her mind when her mother yelled at her. 35 years later, when she was trapped in her demolished car, Ute's brain automatically went into the same survival mode. She made herself disappear. I think this is huge, right? Because we talking about two different kinds of trauma, right? We're talking like in the experience of the car accident, this massive truck accident, right? That is traumatic in and of itself. Stan, his response was interesting, to fight back, right? To fight back, which actually is what the experience was traumatizing, but where it really fucked him up was trying to fight back and not being able to leave, right? If we remember the learned helplessness, the inescapable shock, he could not escape, but he was trying anyway, and futile, right? So he's trapped in those responses of those feelings not being able to be, the loops not being able to be closed, not being able to do anything with those feelings. Ute is interesting because she experienced trauma, but because she already had her own experience with trauma, we don't know Stan's experience with trauma for sure, but Ute has already childhood experiences with trauma, right? So the way she managed her trauma in the past as a child is to shut down. I don't know if she knew that that's what she did, right? Prior to that moment, prior to like this study now about her trauma, right? But now we're talking 35 years later and she's reacting the same way because as a child, this is what she was taught. This was her survival skill. This is how she was taught. This is how her alarm system was already set up. When things are hectic and stressful, there's not much we could do but shut down to keep all that stuff over there because, you know, that keeps me safe. I disappear and nobody will see me. So very fascinating. And there's a whole chapter later on where we talk about childhood trauma, right? Because going to war is very intense for sure. And it can be an extremely traumatic experience, but going to war, coming from a home where there was secure attachment, you were able to play, you were lively, curiosity was rewarded and, you know, nurtured in your home. Going to the way you deal with the trauma of war will be very different than, say, somebody who's never had support through their life and been precarious and scared their whole lives. Now they go to war and they have more trauma to deal with. They're going to deal with that in a different way, right? They're going to deal with hardship differently because their baseline, right, the way that they already inherently naturally deal with conflict and trauma is already impaired. The challenge for people like Ute is to become alert and engaged, a difficult but unavoidable task if they want to recapture their lives. Ute actually did write a book called Mental Illness about her experiences. This is where the bottom-up approach to therapy becomes essential. The aim is to actually change the patient's physiology, his or her relationship to bodily sensations. At the trauma center, we work with such basic measures as heart rate and breathing patterns. We help patients evoke and notice bodily sensations by tapping acupressure points. Rhythmic interactions with other people are also effective. Tossing a beach ball back and forth, bouncing on a Pilates ball, drumming or dancing to music. It's about coming back into attunement. We'll talk about attunement in a little bit as well. Numbing is the other side, not in this video, but in the little book, a little bit in the book. Numbing is the other side of the coin in PTSD, right? Many people might start off like Stan with all these flashbacks that are really explosive, but it's a lot. It's a lot to be constantly feeling that every time you think about that. So we numb out instead. So the other option is to numb out. And, you know, it's actually, we think that that's saving us, but over time, a lack of presence can be even more damaging. To not be able to feel fully in touch with your life, to not be able to be present day to day is a form of hell. It is a very, 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 very damaging. We think that being caught in our trauma is one thing, it's damaging, like being swept up in emotions from the past and trapped in the past, but not feeling shit is equally damaging. Right? You feel like a monster. You feel out of control, out of connection with other human beings. So the challenge of trauma treatment is not only dealing with the past, but even more enhancing the quality of day-to-day experience. We must help. Many treatment approaches are always like, yeah, desensitize, exposure. We're going to talk about your past until it's whatever, and you reduce the emotional responses. But I believe that this is based on a misunderstanding of what happens in traumatic stress. Because when you're doing that, you're reactivating those pathways. You're making it a stronger memory. You're not helping the person get over it. You're actually strengthening those feelings in them. Unless they are grounded in their seat. I know my ass is in this chair. I can see the light. I can hear the breeze. I can feel my heart. Right? Then we can begin to approach the past. We must first of all
We must most of all help our patients to live fully and securely in the present. In order to do that, we need to help bring those brain structures that deserted them when they were overwhelmed by trauma back. Desensitization may make you less reactive, but if you cannot feel satisfaction in ordinary everyday things like taking a walk, cooking a meal, or playing with your kids, life will pass you by and you'll feel crazy.